Chapter 32. Two bridges stood near the lower part of Casterbridge town. The first, of weather-stained brick, was immediately at the end of High Street, where a diverging branch from that thoroughfare ran round to the low-lying Durnover lanes, so that the precincts of the bridge formed the merging point of respectability and indigence. The second bridge, of stone, was further out on the highway, in fact fairly in the meadows, though still within the town boundary. These bridges had speaking countenances. Every projection in each was worn down to obtuseness, partly by weather, more by friction from generations of loungers whose toes and heels had from year to year made restless movements against these parapets, as they had stood there meditating on the aspect of affairs. In the case of the more friable bricks and stones, even the flat faces were worn into hollows by the same mixed mechanism. The masonry of the top was clamped with iron at each joint, since it had been no uncommon thing for desperate men to wrench the coping off and throw it down the river, in reckless defiance of the magistrates. For to this pair of bridges gravitated all the failures of the town, those who had failed in business, in love, in sobriety, in crime. Why the unhappy hereabout usually chose the bridges for their meditations in preference to a railing, a gate, or a stile, was not so clear. There was a marked difference of quality between the personages who haunted the near bridge of brick and the personages who haunted the far one of stone. Those of lowest character preferred the former, adjoining the town. They did not mind the glare of the public eye. They had been of comparatively no account during their successes, and though they might feel dispirited, they had no particular sense of shame in their ruin. Their hands were mostly kept in their pockets. They wore a leather strap round their hips or knees, and boots that required a great deal of lacing, but seemed never to get any. Instead of sighing at their adversities they spat, and instead of saying the iron had entered into their souls, they said they were down on their luck. Jopp, in his time of distress, had often stood here. So had Mother Cuxsom, Christopher Coney, and poor Abel Whittle. The miserables who would pause on the remoter bridge were of a politer stamp. They included bankrupts, hypochondriacs, persons who were what is called out of a situation from fault or lucklessness, the inefficient of the professional class, shabby genteel men who did not know how to get rid of the weary time between breakfast and dinner, and the yet more weary time between dinner and dark. The eye of this species were mostly directed over the parapet upon the running water below. A man seen there, looking thus fixedly into the river, was pretty sure to be one whom the world did not treat kindly for some reason or other, while one in straits on the townward bridge did not mind who saw him so, and kept his back to the parapet to survey the passers-by. One in straits on this never faced the road, never turned his head at coming footsteps, but, sensitive to his own condition, watched the current whenever a stranger approached, as if some strange fish interested him, though every finned thing had been poached out of the river years before. There and thus they would muse. If their grief were the grief of oppression, they would wish themselves kings. If their grief were poverty, wish themselves millionaires. If sin, they would wish they were saints or angels. If despised love, that they were some much-courted Adonis of county fame. Some had been known to stand and think so long with this fixed gaze downward that eventually they had allowed their poor carcasses to follow that gaze, and they were discovered the next morning out of reach of their troubles, either here or in the deep pool called Blackwater, a little higher up the river. To this bridge came Henchard, as other unfortunates had come before him, his way thither being by the riverside path on the chilly edge of the town. Here he was standing one windy afternoon when Durnover church clock struck 5. While the gusts were bringing the notes to his ears across the damp intervening flat, a man passed behind him and greeted Henchard by name. Henchard turned slightly and saw that the comer was Jopp, his old foreman, now employed elsewhere, to whom, though he hated him, he had gone for lodgings, because Jopp was the one man in Casterbridge whose observation and opinion the fallen corn merchant despised to the point of indifference. Henchard returned him a scarcely perceptible nod, and Jopp stopped. "He and she are gone into their new house to-day," said Jopp. "Oh," said Henchard absently. "Which house is that?" "Your old one." "Gone into my house?" And starting up, Henchard added, My house of all others in the town? Well, if somebody was sure to live there, and you couldn't, it can do 'ee no harm that he's the man." It was quite true. He felt that it was doing him no harm. Farfrae, who had already taken the yards and stores, had acquired possession of the house for the obvious convenience of its contiguity, and yet this act of his taking up residence within those roomy chambers, while he, their former tenant, lived in a cottage, galled Henchard indescribably. Jopp continued, "And you heard of that fellow who bought all the best furniture at your sale? He was bidding for no other than Farfrae all the while. It has never been moved out of the house, as he'd already got the lease." "My furniture too? Surely he'll buy my body and soul likewise." "There's no saying he won't, if you be willing to sell." And having planted these wounds in the heart of his once imperious master, Jopp went on his way, while Henchard stared and stared into the racing river till the bridge seemed moving backward with him. The low land grew blacker, and the sky a deeper grey. When the landscape looked like a picture blotted in with ink, another traveller approached the great stone bridge. He was driving a gig, his direction being also townwards. On the round of the middle of the arch the gig stopped. "Mr. Henchard?" came from it in the voice of Farfrae. Henchard turned his face. Finding that he had guessed rightly, Farfrae told the man who accompanied him to drive home, while he alighted and went up to his former friend. "I have heard that you think of emigrating, Mr. Henchard," he said. "Is it true? I have a real reason for asking." Henchard withheld his answer for several instants, and then said, "Yes, it is true. I am going where you were going to a few years ago, when I prevented you and got you to bide here. 'Tis turn and turn about, isn't it? Do ye mind how we stood like this in the chalk walk when I persuaded ye to stay? You then stood without a chattel to your name, and I was the master of the house in Corn Street. But now I stand without a stick or a rag, and the master of that house is you." "Yes, yes, that's so. It's the way of the world," said Farfrae. "Ha ha, true!" cried Henchard, throwing himself into a mood of jocularity. "Up and down. I'm used to it. What's the odds, after all?" "Now listen to me, if it's no taking up your time," said Farfrae, "just as I listen to you. Don't go. Stay at home." "But I can do nothing else, man," said Henchard scornfully. "The little money I have will just keep body and soul together for a few weeks, and no more. I have not felt inclined to go back to journey work yet, but I can't stay doing nothing, and my best chance is elsewhere." "No, but what I propose is this, if you will listen. Come and live in your old house. We can spare some rooms very well. I am sure my wife would not mind it at all, until there's an opening for ye." Henchard started. Probably the picture drawn by the unsuspecting Donald of himself under the same roof with Lucetta was too striking to be received with equanimity. "No, no," he said gruffly, "we should quarrel." "You should hae a part to yourself," said Farfrae, "and nobody to interfere wi' you. It will be a deal healthier than down there by the river where you live now." Still Henchard refused. "You don't know what you ask," he said. "However, I can do no less than thank ye." They walked into the town together side by side, as they had done when Henchard persuaded the young Scotchman to remain. "Will you come in and have some supper?" said Farfrae when they reached the middle of the town, where their paths diverged right and left. "No, no." "By the by, I had nearly forgot. I bought a good deal of your furniture." "So I have heard." "Well, it was no that I wanted it so very much for myself, but I wish ye to pick out all that you care to have, such things as may be endeared to ye by associations, or particularly suited to your use, and take them to your own house. It will not be depriving me. We can do with less very well, and I will have plenty of opportunities of getting more." "What, give it to me for nothing?" said Henchard. "But you paid the creditors for it." "Ah, yes, but maybe it's worth more to you than it is to me." Henchard was a little moved. "I sometimes think I've wronged 'ee," he said, in tones which showed the disquietude that the night shades hid in his face. He shook Farfrae abruptly by the hand, and hastened away, as if unwilling to betray himself further. Farfrae saw him turn through the thoroughfare into Bull Stake, and vanish down towards the Priory Mill. Meanwhile Elizabeth Jane, in an upper room no larger than the prophet's chamber, and with the silk attire of her palmy days packed away in a box, was netting with great industry between the hours which she devoted to studying such books as she could get hold of. Her lodgings being nearly opposite her stepfather's former residence, now Farfrae's, she could see Donald and Lucetta speeding in and out of their door with all the bounding enthusiasm of their situation. She avoided looking that way as much as possible, but it was hardly in human nature to keep the eyes averted when the door slammed. While living on thus quietly, she heard the news that Henchard had caught cold and was confined to his room, possibly a result of standing about the meads in damp weather. She went off to his house at once. This time she was determined not to be denied admittance, and made her way upstairs. He was sitting up in the bed with a greatcoat round him, and at first resented her intrusion. Go away," he said. "I don't like to see 'ee." "But, father—" "I don't like to see 'ee," he repeated. However, the ice was broken, and she remained. She made the room more comfortable, gave directions to the people below, and by the time she went away had reconciled her stepfather to her visiting him. The effect either of her ministrations or of her mere presence was a rapid recovery. He soon was well enough to go out, and now things seemed to wear a new colour in his eyes. He no longer thought of emigration, and thought more of Elizabeth. The having nothing to do made him more dreary than any other circumstance, and one day, with better views of Farfrae than he had held for some time, and a sense that honest work was not a thing to be ashamed of, he stoically went down to Farfrae's yard and asked to be taken on as a journeyman hay-trusser. He was engaged at once. This hiring of Henchard was done through a foreman, Farfrae feeling that it was undesirable to come personally in contact with the ex-corn factor more than was absolutely necessary. While anxious to help him, he was well aware by this time of his uncertain temper, and thought reserved relations best. For the same reason his orders to Henchard to proceed to this and that country farm, trussing in the usual way, were always given through a third person. For a time these arrangements worked well, it being the custom to truss in the respective stackyards before bringing it away, the hay bought at the different farms about the neighbourhood, so that Henchard was often absent at such places the whole week long. When this was all done, and Henchard had become in a measure broken in, he came to work daily on the home premises like the rest, and thus the once flourishing merchant, and mayor, and what not, stood as a day-labourer in the barns and granaries he formerly had owned. "I have worked as a journeyman before now, han't I?" he would say in his defiant way, "and why shouldn't I do it again?" But he looked a far different journeyman from the one he had been in his earlier days. Then he had worn clean, suitable clothes, light and cheerful in hue, leggings yellow as marigolds, corduroys immaculate as new flax, and a neckerchief like a flower-garden. Now he wore the remains of an old blue cloth suit of his gentlemanly times, a rusty silk hat, and a once black satin stock soiled and shabby. Clad thus he went to and fro, still comparatively an active man, for he was not much over 40, and saw with the other men in the yard Donald Farfrae going in and out of the green door that led to the garden and the big house and Lucetta. At the beginning of the winter it was rumoured about Casterbridge that Mr. Farfrae, already in the town council, was to be proposed for mayor in a year or two. Yes, she was wise in her generation, said Henchard to himself when he heard of this one day on his way to Farfrae's hay barn. He thought it over as he wimbled his bonds, and the piece of news acted as a reviviscent breath to that old view of his, of Donald Farfrae as his triumphant rival who rode roughshod over him. "A fellow of his age going to be mayor indeed," he murmured with a corner-drawn smile on his mouth. "But 'tis her money that floats and upward. Ha ha! How cussed odd it is! Here be I, his former master, working for him as man, and he the man standing as master, with my house and my furniture, and my what you may call wife all his own." He repeated these things 100 times a day. During the whole period of his acquaintance with Lucetta he had never wished to claim her as his own so desperately as he now regretted her loss. It was no mercenary hankering after her fortune that moved him, though that fortune had been the means of making her so much the more desired by giving her the air of independence and sauciness which attracts men of his composition. It had given her servants, house, and fine clothing, a setting that invested Lucetta with a startling novelty in the eyes of him who had known her in her narrow days. He accordingly lapsed into moodiness, and at every allusion to the possibility of Farfrae's near election to the municipal chair, his former hatred of the Scotchman returned. Concurrently with this, he underwent a moral change. It resulted in his significantly saying every now and then, in tones of recklessness, "Only a fortnight more, only a dozen days," and so forth, lessening his figures day by day. "Why d'ye say only a dozen days?" asked Solomon Longways, as he worked beside Henchard in the granary waiting oats. "Because in 12 days I shall be released from my oath." "What oath?" "The oath to drink no spirituous liquid. In 12 days it will be 21 years since I swore it, and then I mean to enjoy myself, please God." Elizabeth Jane sat at her window one Sunday, and while there she heard in the street below a conversation which introduced Henchard's name. She was wondering what was the matter when a third person who was passing by asked the question in her mind. "Michael Henchard have busted out drinking after taking nothing for 21 years." Elizabeth Jane jumped up, put on her things, and went out. End of Chapter 32. Chapter 33. At this date there prevailed in Casterbridge a convivial custom scarcely recognized as such, yet none the less established. On the afternoon of every Sunday a large contingent of the Casterbridge journeymen, steady churchgoers and sedate characters, having attended service, filed from the church doors across the way to the Three Mariners Inn. The rear was usually brought up by the choir, with their bass viols, fiddles, and flutes under their arms. The great point, the point of honour on these sacred occasions, was for each man to strictly limit himself to half a pint of liquor. This scrupulosity was so well understood by the landlord that the whole company was served in cups of that measure. They were all exactly alike, straight-sided, with 2 leafless lime trees done in eel brown on the sides, one towards the drinker's lips, the other confronting his comrade. To wonder how many of these cups the landlord possessed altogether was a favourite exercise of children in the marvellous. 40 at least might have been seen at these times in the large room, forming a ring round the margin of the great 16-legged oak table, like the monolithic circle of Stonehenge in its pristine days. Outside and above the 40 cups came a circle of 40 smoke-jets from 40 clay pipes. Outside the pipes the countenances of the 40 churchgoers, supported at the back by a circle of 40 chairs. The conversation was not the conversation of weekdays, but a thing altogether finer in point and higher in tone. They invariably discussed the sermon, dissecting it, weighing it, as above or below the average, the general tendency being to regard it as a scientific feat or performance which had no relation to their own lives, except as between critics and the thing criticized. The bass viol player and the clerk usually spoke with more authority than the rest, on account of their official connection with the preacher. Now the Three Mariners was the inn chosen by Henchard as the place for closing his long term of dramless years. He had so timed his entry as to be well established in the large room by the time the 40 churchgoers entered to their customary cups. The flush upon his face proclaimed at once that the vow of 21 years had lapsed, and the era of recklessness begun anew. He was seated on a small table, drawn up to the side of the massive oak board reserved for the churchmen, a few of whom nodded to him as they took their places, and said, "How be ye, Mr. Henchard? Quite a stranger here." Henchard did not take the trouble to reply for a few moments, and his eyes rested on his stretched-out legs and boots. "Yes," he said at length, "that's true. I've been down in spirit for weeks. Some of ye know the cause. I am better now, but not quite serene. I want you fellows of the choir to strike up a tune, and what with that and this brew of Standage's, I am in hopes of getting altogether out of my minor key." "With all my heart," said the first fiddle. "We've let back our strings, that's true, but we can soon pull 'em up again. Sound A, neighbours, and give the man a stave." "I don't care a curse what the words be," said Henchard. "Hymns, ballets, or rantipole rubbish. The Rogues' March or the Cherubim's Warble, 'tis all the same to me, if 'tis good harmony, and well put out." "Well, it may be we can do that, and not a man among us that have sat in the gallery less than 20 year," said the leader of the band. "As 'tis Sunday, neighbours, suppose we raise the 4th psalm to Samuel Wakely's tune as improved by me." "Hang Samuel Wakely's tune as improved by thee," said Henchard. Chuck across one of your psalters. Old Wiltshire is the only tune worth singing, the psalm tune that would make my blood ebb and flow like the sea when I was a steady chap. I'll find some words to fit'n." He took one of the psalters and began turning over the leaves. Chancing to look out of the window at that moment, he saw a flock of people passing by, and perceived them to be the congregation of the upper church now just dismissed, their sermon having been a longer one than that the lower parish was favoured with. Among the rest of the leading inhabitants walked Mr. Councillor Farfrae, with Lucetta upon his arm, the observed and imitated of all the smaller tradesmen's womankind. Henchard's mouth changed a little, and he continued to turn over the leaves. "Now then," he said, "Psalm the 109th, to the tune of Wiltshire, verses 10 to 15. I gie ye the words. His seed shall orphans be, his wife a widow plunged in grief, his vagrant children beg their bread, where none can give relief. His ill-got riches shall be made to usurers a prey. The fruit of all his toil shall be by strangers borne away. None shall be found that to his wants their mercy will extend, or to his helpless orphan seed the least assistance lend. A swift destruction soon shall seize on his unhappy race, and the next age his hated name shall utterly deface." "I know the psalm, I know the psalm," said the leader hastily. "But would his leaf not sing it? 'Twasn't made for singing. We chose it once when the gipsy stole the parson's mare, thinking to please him, but parson were quite upset. Whatever Servant David were thinking about when he made a psalm that nobody can sing without disgracing himself, I can't fathom. Now then, the 4th Psalm, to Samuel Wakeley's tune as improved by me." "Od seize your sauce! I tell you to sing the 109th to Wiltshire, and sing it you shall," roared Henchard. "Not a single one of all the droning crew of ye goes out of this room till that psalm is sung." He slipped off the table, seized the poker, and going to the door placed his back against it. "Now then, go ahead, if you don't wish to have your cussed pates broke." Don't 'ee take on so, as 'tis the Sabbath day, and 'tis Servant David's words and not ours. Perhaps we don't mind for once, hey?" said one of the terrified choir, looking round upon the rest. So the instruments were tuned and the comminatory verses sung. "Thank ye, said Henchard in a softened voice, his eyes growing downcast, and his manner that of a man much moved by the strains. "Don't you blame David," he went on in low tones, shaking his head without raising his eyes. "He knew what he was about when he wrote that. If I could afford it, be hanged if I wouldn't keep a church choir at my own expense to play and sing to me at these low dark times of my life. But the bitter thing is that when I was rich I didn't need what I could have, and now I be poor I can't have what I need." While they paused, Lucetta and Farfrae passed again, this time homeward, it being their custom to take, like others, a short walk out on the highway and back between church and tea-time. "There's the man we've been singing about," said Henchard. The players and singers turned their heads and saw his meaning. "Heaven forbid!" said the bass player. "'Tis the man," repeated Henchard doggedly. "Then if I'd known," said the performer on the clarionet solemnly, "that 'twas meant for a living man, nothing should have drawn out of my windpipe the breath for that psalm, so help me." "Nor from mine," said the first singer. "But, thought I, as it was made so long ago, perhaps there isn't much in it, so I'll oblige a neighbour, for there's nothing to be said against the tune." "Ah, my boys, you've sung it," said Henchard triumphantly. "As for him, it was partly by his songs that he got over me, and heaved me out. I could double him up like that, and yet I don't." He laid the poker across his knee, bent it as if it were a twig, flung it down, and came away from the door. It was at this time that Elizabeth Jane, having heard where her stepfather was, entered the room with a pale and agonized countenance. The choir and the rest of the company moved off, in accordance with their half-pint regulation. Elizabeth Jane went up to Henchard and entreated him to accompany her home. By this hour the volcanic fires of his nature had burnt down, and having drunk no great quantity as yet, he was inclined to acquiesce. She took his arm, and together they went on. Henchard walked blankly, like a blind man, repeating to himself the last words of the singers. "And the next age his hated name shall utterly deface." At length he said to her, "I am a man to my word. I have kept my oath for 21 years, and now I can drink with a good conscience. If I don't do for him, Well, I am a fearful practical joker when I choose. He has taken away everything from me, and by heavens if I meet him I won't answer for my deeds." These half-uttered words alarmed Elizabeth, all the more by reason of the still determination of Henchard's men. "What will you do?" she asked cautiously, while trembling with disquietude, and guessing Henchard's allusion only too well. Henchard did not answer, and they went on till they had reached his cottage. "May I come in?" she said. "No, not to-day," said Henchard, and she went away, feeling that to caution Farfrae was almost her duty, as it was certainly her strong desire. As on the Sunday, so on the weekdays Farfrae and Lucetta might have been seen flitting about the town like two butterflies, or rather like a bee and a butterfly in league for life. She seemed to take no pleasure in going anywhere except in her husband's company, and hence, when business would not permit him to waste an afternoon, she remained indoors waiting for the time to pass till his return, her face being visible to Elizabeth Jane from her window aloft. The latter, however, did not say to herself that Farfrae should be thankful for such devotion, but full of her reading she cited Rosalind's exclamation, "Mistress, know yourself, down on your knees and thank Heaven fasting for a good man's love." She kept her eye upon Henchard also. One day he answered her inquiry for his health by saying that he could not endure Abel Whittle's pitying eyes upon him while they worked together in the yard. "He is such a fool," said Henchard, "that he can never get out of his mind the time when I was master there." "I'll come and wimble for you instead of him, if you will allow me," said she. Her motive on going to the yard was to get an opportunity of observing the general position of affairs on Farfrae's premises, now that her stepfather was a workman there. Henchard's threats had alarmed her so much that she wished to see his behaviour when the two were face to face. For 2 or 3 days after her arrival Donald did not make any appearance. Then one afternoon the green door opened, and through came first Farfrae, and at his heels Lucetta. Donald brought his wife forward without hesitation, it being obvious that he had no suspicion whatever of any antecedents in common between her and the now journeyman hay-trusser. Henchard did not turn his eyes toward either of the pair, keeping them fixed on the bond he twisted, as if that alone absorbed him. A feeling of delicacy, which ever prompted Farfrae to avoid anything that might seem like triumphing over a fallen rival, led him to keep away from the hay-barn where Henchard and his daughter were working, and to go on to the corn department. Meanwhile Lucetta, never having been informed that Henchard had entered her husband's service, rambled straight on to the barn, where she came suddenly upon Henchard, and gave vent to a little "Oh!" which the happy and busy Donald was too far off to hear. Henchard, with withering humility of demeanour, touched the brim of his hat to her, as Whittle and the rest had done, to which she breathed a dead-alive "Good afternoon." "I beg your pardon, ma'am?" said Henchard, as if he had not heard. "I said good afternoon," she faltered. "Oh yes, good afternoon, ma'am," he replied, touching his hat again. "I am glad to see you, ma'am." Lucetta looked embarrassed, and Henchard continued, "For we humble workmen here feel it is a great honour that a lady should look in and take an interest in us." She glanced at him entreatingly. The sarcasm was too bitter, too unendurable. "Can you tell me the time, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes," she said hastily, 4:30. "Thank'ee. An hour and a half longer before we are released from work. Ah, ma'am, we of the lower classes know nothing of the gay leisure that such as you enjoy." As soon as she could do so Lucetta left him, nodded and smiled to Elizabeth Jane, and joined her husband at the other end of the enclosure, where she could be seen leading him away by the outer gates, so as to avoid passing Henchard again. That she had been taken by surprise was obvious. The result of this casual rencounter was that the next morning a note was put into Henchard's hand by the postman. "Will you," said Lucetta, with as much bitterness as she could put into a small communication, "will you kindly undertake not to speak to me in the biting undertones you used to-day if I walk through the yard at any time? I bear you no ill will, and I am only too glad that you should have employment of my dear husband, but in common fairness treat me as his wife, and do not try to make me wretched by covert sneers. I have committed no crime and done you no injury." "Poor fool!" said Henchard with fond savagery, holding out the note. To know no better than commit herself in writing like this? Why, if I were to show that to her dear husband, pooh!" He threw the letter into the fire. Lucetta took care not to come again among the hay and corn. She would rather have died than run the risk of encountering Henchard at such close quarters a second time. The gulf between them was growing wider every day. Farfrae was always considerate to his fallen acquaintance, but it was impossible that he should not, by degrees, cease to regard the ex-corn merchant as more than one of his other workmen. Henchard saw this, and concealed his feelings under a cover of stolidity, fortifying his heart by drinking more freely at the Three Mariners every evening. Often did Elizabeth Jane, in her endeavours to prevent his taking other liquor, carry tea to him in a little basket at 5 o'clock. Arriving one day on this errand, she found her stepfather was measuring up clover seed and rape seed in the corn stores on the top floor, and she ascended to him. Each floor had a door opening into the air under a cat head, from which a chain dangled for hoisting the sacks. When Elizabeth's head rose through the trap, she perceived that the upper door was open, and that her stepfather and Farfrae stood just within it in conversation, Farfrae being nearest the dizzy edge, and Henchard a little way behind. Not to interrupt them, she remained on the steps without raising her head any higher. While waiting thus, she saw, or fancied she saw, for she had a terror of feeling certain, her stepfather slowly raise his hand to a level behind Farfrae's shoulders, a curious expression taking possession of his face. The young man was quite unconscious of the action, which was so indirect that if Farfrae had observed it he might almost have regarded it as an idle outstretching of the arm. But it would have been possible, by a comparatively light touch, to push Farfrae off his balance and send him head over heels into the air. Elizabeth felt quite sick at heart on thinking of what this might have meant. As soon as they turned she mechanically took the tea to Henchard, left it and went away. Reflecting, she endeavoured to assure herself that the movement was an idle eccentricity and no more. Yet, on the other hand, his subordinate position, in an establishment where he once had been the master, might be acting on him like an irritant poison, and she finally resolved to caution Donald. End of Chapter 33. Chapter 34. Next morning, accordingly, she rose at 5 o'clock and went into the street. It was not yet light. A dense fog prevailed, and the town was as silent as it was dark, except that from the rectangular avenues which framed in the borough there came a chorus of tiny rappings, caused by the fall of water drops condensed on the boughs. Now it was wafted from the west walk, now from the south walk, and then from both quarters simultaneously. She moved on to the bottom of Corn Street, and knowing his time well, waited only a few minutes before she heard the familiar bang of his door, and then his quick walk towards her. She met him at the point where the last tree of the engirding avenue flanked the last house in the street. He could hardly discern her till, glancing inquiringly, he said, "What, Miss Henchard? And are ye up so early?" She asked him to pardon her for waylaying him at such an unseemly time. "But I am anxious to mention something," she said, "and I wished not to alarm Mrs. Farfrae by calling." "Yes," said he, with the cheeriness of a superior. "And what may it be? It's very kind of ye, I'm sure." She now felt the difficulty of conveying to his mind the exact aspect of possibilities in her own, but she somehow began, and introduced Henchard's name. "I sometimes fear," she said with an effort, "that he may be betrayed into some attempt to insult you, sir." "But we are the best of friends." "Or to play some practical joke upon you, sir. Remember that he has been hardly used." "But we are quite friendly." "Or to do something that would injure you, hurt you, wound you." Every word cost her twice its length of pain, and she could see that Farfrae was still incredulous. Henchard, a poor man in his employ, was not to Farfrae's view the Henchard who had ruled him. Yet he was not only the same man, but that man with his sinister qualities, formerly latent, quickened into life by his buffetings. Farfrae, happy and thinking no evil, persisted in making light of her fears. Thus they parted, and she went homeward, journeymen now being in the street, waggoners going to the harness makers for articles left to be repaired, farm horses going to the shoeing smiths, and the sons of labour showing themselves generally on the move. Elizabeth entered her lodging unhappily, thinking she had done no good, and only made herself appear foolish by her weak note of warning. But Donald Farfrae was one of those men upon whom an incident is never absolutely lost. He revised impressions from a subsequent point of view, and the impulsive judgment of the moment was not always his permanent one. The vision of Elizabeth's earnest face in the rimy dawn came back to him several times during the day. Knowing the solidity of her character, he did not treat her hints altogether as idle sounds. But he did not desist from a kindly scheme on Henchard's account that engaged him just then, and when he met Lawyer Joyce, the town clerk, later in the day, he spoke of it as if nothing had occurred to damp it. "About that little seedsman's shop," he said, "the shop overlooking the churchyard, which is to let. It is not for myself I want it, but for our unlucky fellow townsman Henchard. It would be a new beginning for him, if a small one, and I have told the council that I would head a private subscription among them to set him up in it, that I would be £50 if they would make up the other 50 among them." "Yes, yes, so I've heard, and there's nothing to say against it, for that matter," the town clerk replied, in his plain, frank way. "But, Farfrae, others see what you don't. Henchard hates 'ee, hates 'ee, and 'tis right that you should know it. To my knowledge he was at the Three Mariners last night, saying in public that about you which a man ought not to say about another." "Is that so? Ah, is that so?" said Farfrae, looking down. "Why should he do it?" added the young man bitterly. "What harm have I done him, that he should try to wrong me?" "God only knows," said Joyce, lifting his eyebrows. "It shows much long-suffering in you to put up with him and keep him in your employ." "But I cannot discharge a man who was once a good friend to me. How can I forget that when I came here 'twas he enabled me to make a footing for myself? No, no, as long as I've a day's work to offer he shall do it if he chooses. 'Tis not I who will deny him such a little as that. But I'll drop the idea of establishing him in a shop till I can think more about it." It grieved Farfrae much to give up this scheme, but a damp having been thrown over it by these and other voices in the air, he went and countermanded his orders. The then occupier of the shop was in it when Farfrae spoke to him, and feeling it necessary to give some explanation of his withdrawal from the negotiation, Donald mentioned Henchard's name, and stated that the intentions of the council had been changed. The occupier was much disappointed, and straightway informed Henchard, as soon as he saw him, that a scheme of the council for setting him up in a shop had been knocked on the head by Farfrae, and thus out of error enmity grew. When Farfrae got indoors that evening, the tea-kettle was singing on the high hob of the semi-egg-shaped grate. Lucetta, light as a sylph, ran forward and seized his hands, whereupon Farfrae duly kissed her. "Oh," she cried playfully, turning to the window, "see, the blinds are not drawn down, and the people can look in. What a scandal!" When the candles were lighted, the curtains drawn, and the twain sat at tea, she noticed that he looked serious. Without directly inquiring why, she let her eyes linger solicitously on his face. "Who has called?" he absently asked. "Any folk for me?" "No," said Lucetta. "What's the matter, Donald?" "Well, nothing worth talking of," he responded sadly. "Then never mind it. You will get through it. Scotchmen are always lucky." "No, not always," he said, shaking his head gloomily as he contemplated a crumb on the table. "I know many who have not been so. There was Sandy MacFarlane, who started to America to try his fortune, and he was drowned. And Archibald Leith, he was murdered. And poor Willie Dunblees and Maitland McFreeze, they fell into bad courses and went the way of all such." "Why, you old goosey, I was only speaking in a general sense, of course. You are always so literal. Now, when we have finished tea, sing me that funny song about high-heeled shoon and siller tags, and the 1 and 40 wooers." "Oh, no, I couldn't sing to-night. It's Henchard. He hates me, so that I may not be his friend if I would. I would understand why there should be a wee bit of envy, but I cannot see a reason for the whole intensity of what he feels. Now can you, Lucetta? It is more like old-fashioned rivalry in love than just a bit of rivalry in trade." Lucetta had grown somewhat wan. "No," she replied. I give him employment, I cannot refuse it, but neither can I blind myself to the fact that with a man of passions such as his there is no safeguard for conduct." "What have you heard, oh, Donald dearest?" said Lucetta in alarm. The words on her lips were, "Anything about me?" but she did not utter them. She could not, however, suppress her agitation, and her eyes filled with tears. "No, no, it is not so serious as ye fancy," declared Farfrae soothingly, though he did not know its seriousness so well as she. "I wish you would do what we have talked of," mournfully remarked Lucetta. "Give up business and go away from here. We have plenty of money, and why should we stay?" Farfrae seemed seriously disposed to discuss this move, and they talked thereon till a visitor was announced. Their neighbour, Alderman Vatt, came in. "You've heard, I suppose, of poor Dr. Chalkfield's death?" "Yes, died this afternoon at 5, said Mr. Vatt. Chalkfield was the councilman who had succeeded to the mayoralty in the preceding November. Farfrae was sorry at the intelligence, and Mr. Vatt continued, "Well, we know he's been going some days, and as his family is well provided for, we must take it all as it is. Now I have called to ask ye this, quite privately. If I should nominate 'ee to succeed him, and there should be no particular opposition, will 'ee accept the chair?" "But there are folk whose turn is before mine, and I'm over young, and may be thought pushing," said Farfrae after a pause. "Not at all. I don't speak for myself only. Several have named it. You won't refuse." "We thought of going away," interposed Lucetta, looking at Farfrae anxiously. "It was only a fancy," Farfrae murmured. "I wouldn't have refused if it is the wish of a respectable majority in the council." "Very well, then, look upon yourself as elected. We have had older men long enough." When he was gone, Farfrae said musingly, "See now how it's ourselves that are ruled by the powers above us. We plan this, but we do that. If they want to make me mayor I will stay, and Henchard must rave as he will." From this evening onward Lucetta was very uneasy. If she had not been imprudence incarnate she would not have acted as she did when she met Henchard by accident a day or two later. It was in the bustle of the market, when no one could readily notice their discourse. "Michael," said she, "I must again ask you what I asked you months ago, to return me any letters or papers of mine that you may have, unless you have destroyed them. You must see how desirable it is that the time at Jersey should be blotted out for the good of all parties. Why, bless the woman, I packed up every scrap of your handwriting to give you in the coach, but you never appeared." She explained how the death of her aunt had prevented her taking the journey on that day. "And what became of the parcel then?" she asked. He could not say. He would consider. When she was gone he recollected that he had left a heap of useless papers in his former dining-room safe, built up in the wall of his old house, now occupied by Farfrae. The letters might have been amongst them. A grotesque grin shaped itself on Henchard's face. Had that safe been opened? On the very evening which followed this there was a great ringing of bells in Casterbridge, and the combined brass, wood, catgut, and leather bands played round the town with more prodigality of percussion notes than ever. Farfrae was mayor, the 200th odd of a series forming an elective dynasty dating back to the days of Charles I, and the fair Lucetta was the courted of the town. But ah, the worm i' the bud, Henchard, what he could tell! He, in the meantime, festering with indignation at some erroneous intelligence of Farfrae's opposition to the scheme for installing him in the little seed shop, was greeted with the news of the municipal election, which, by reason of Farfrae's comparative youth and his Scottish nativity, a thing unprecedented in the case, had an interest far beyond the ordinary. The bell ringing and the band playing, loud as Tamerlane's trumpet, goaded the downfallen Henchard indescribably. The ousting now seemed to him to be complete. The next morning he went to the corn-yard as usual, and about 11 o'clock Donald entered through the green door, with no trace of the worshipful about him. The yet more emphatic change of places between him and Henchard, which this election had established, renewed a slight embarrassment in the manner of the modest young man. But Henchard showed the front of one who had overlooked all this, and Farfrae met his amenities halfway at once. "I was going to ask you," said Henchard, "about a packet that I may possibly have left in my old safe in the dining-room." He added particulars. "If so, it is there now," said Farfrae. "I have never opened the safe at all as yet, for I keep my papers at the bank to sleep easy o' nights." "It was not of much consequence—to me," said Henchard. "But I'll call for it this evening, if you don't mind." It was quite late when he fulfilled his promise. He had primed himself with grog, as he did very frequently now, and a curl of sardonic humour hung on his lip as he approached the house, as though he were contemplating some terrible form of amusement. Whatever it was, the incident of his entry did not diminish its force, this being his first visit to the house since he had lived there as owner. The ring of the bell spoke to him like the voice of a familiar drudge who had been bribed to forsake him. The movements of the doors were revivals of dead days. Farfrae invited him into the dining-room, where he at once unlocked the iron safe built into the wall. Henchard's safe, made by an ingenious locksmith under his direction. Farfrae drew thence the parcel and other papers, with apologies for not having returned them. "Never mind," said Henchard dryly. "The fact is, they are letters mostly. Yes," he went on, sitting down and unfolding Lucetta's passionate bundle, "here they be. That ever I should see 'em again! I hope Mrs. Farfrae is well after her exertions of yesterday?" "She has felt a bit weary, and has gone to bed early on that account." Henchard returned to the letters, sorting them over with interest, Farfrae being seated at the other end of the dining-table. "You don't forget, of course," he resumed, "that curious chapter in the history of my past which I told you of, and that you gave me some assistance in? These letters are in fact related to that unhappy business, though, thank God, it is all over now." "What became of the poor woman?" asked Farfrae. "Luckily she married, and married well," said Henchard, "so that these reproaches she poured out on me do not now cause me any twinges, as they might otherwise have done. Just listen to what an angry woman will say." Farfrae, willing to humour Henchard, though quite uninterested, and bursting with yawns, gave well-mannered attention. "For me," Henchard read, "there is practically no future. A creature too unconventionally devoted to you, who feels it impossible that she can be the wife of any other man, and who is yet no more to you than the first woman you meet in the street. Such am I. I quite acquit you of any intention to wrong me, yet you are the door through which wrong has come to me. That in the event of your present wife's death you will place me in her position is a consolation so far as it goes, but how far does it go? Thus I sit here, forsaken by my few acquaintance, and forsaken by you." "That's how she went on to me," said Henchard. "Acres of words like that, when what had happened was what I could not cure." "Yes," said Farfrae absently, "it is the way wi' women." But the fact was that he knew very little of the sex, yet detecting a sort of resemblance in style between the effusions of the woman he worshipped and those of the supposed stranger, he concluded that Aphrodite ever spoke thus, whosesoever the personality she assumed. Henchard unfolded another letter and read it through likewise, stopping at the subscription as before. "Her name I don't give," he said blandly. "As I didn't marry her, and another man did, I can scarcely do that in fairness to her." "True, true," said Farfrae. "But why didn't you marry her when your wife Susan died?" Farfrae asked this and the other questions in the comfortably indifferent tone of one whom the matter very remotely concerned. "Ah, well you may ask that," said Henchard, the new moon-shaped grin adumbrating itself again upon his mouth. "In spite of all her protestations, when I came forward to do so, as in generosity bound, she was not the woman for me." "She had already married another, maybe?" Henchard seemed to think it would be sailing too near the wind to descend further into particulars, and he answered yes. "The young lady must have had a heart that bore transplanting very readily." "She had, she had," said Henchard emphatically. He opened a third and fourth letter and read. This time he approached the conclusion as if the signature were indeed coming with the rest. But again he stopped short. The truth was that, as may be divined, He had quite intended to effect a grand catastrophe at the end of this drama by reading out the name. He had come to the house with no other thought. But sitting here in cold blood he could not do it. Such a wrecking of hearts appalled even him. His quality was such that he could have annihilated them both in the heat of action, but to accomplish the deed by oral poison was beyond the nerve of his enmity. End of Chapter 34. Chapter 35. As Donald stated, Lucetta had retired early to her room because of fatigue. She had, however, not gone to rest, but sat in the bedside chair reading and thinking over the events of the day. At the ringing of the doorbell by Henchard she wondered who it should be that would call at that comparatively late hour. The dining-room was almost under her bedroom. She could hear that somebody was admitted there, and presently the indistinct murmur of a person reading became audible. The usual time for Donald's arrival upstairs came and passed, yet still the reading and conversation went on. This was very singular. She could think of nothing but that some extraordinary crime had been committed, and that the visitor, whoever he might be, was reading an account of it from a special edition of the Casterbridge Chronicle. At last she left the room and descended the stairs. The dining-room door was ajar, and in the silence of the resting household the voice and the words were recognizable before she reached the lower flight. She stood transfixed. Her own words greeted her in Henchard's voice like spirits from the grave. Lucetta leant upon the banister with her cheek against the smooth handrail, as if she would make a friend of it in her misery. Rigid in this position, more and more words fell successively upon her ear. But what amazed her most was the tone of her husband. He spoke merely in the accents of a man who made a present of his time. "One word," he was saying, as the crackling of paper denoted that Henchard was unfolding yet another sheet. "Is it quite fair to this young woman's memory to read at such length to a stranger what was intended for your eye alone?" "Well, yes," said Henchard. "By not giving her name I make it an example of all womankind, and not a scandal to one." "If I were you I would destroy them," said Farfrae, giving more thought to the letters than he had hitherto done. "As another man's wife it would injure the woman if it were known." "No, I shall not destroy them," murmured Henchard, putting the letters away. Then he arose, and Lucetta heard no more. She went back to her bedroom in a semi-paralyzed state. For very fear she could not undress, but sat on the edge of the bed waiting. Would Henchard let out the secret in his parting words? Her suspense was terrible. Had she confessed all to Donald in their early acquaintance he might possibly have got over it, and married her just the same, unlikely as it had once seemed. But for her or any one else to tell him now would be fatal. The door slammed. She could hear her husband bolting it. After looking round in his customary way he came leisurely up the stairs. The spark in her eyes well nigh went out when he appeared round the bedroom door. Her gaze hung doubtful for a moment. Then, to her joyous amazement, she saw that he looked at her with the rallying smile of one who had just been relieved of a scene that was irksome. She could hold out no longer, and sobbed hysterically. When he had restored her, Farfrae naturally enough spoke of Henchard. "Of all men he was the least desirable as a visitor," he said. "But it is my belief that he's just a bit crazed. He has been reading to me a long lot of letters relating to his past life, and I could do no less than indulge him by listening." This was sufficient. Henchard then had not told. Henchard's last words to Farfrae, in short, as he stood on the doorstep, had been these: "Well, I'm obliged to 'ee for listening. I may tell more about her some day." Finding this, she was much perplexed as to Henchard's motives in opening the matter at all, for in such cases we attribute to an enemy a power of consistent action which we never find in ourselves or in our friends, and forget that abortive efforts from want of heart are as possible to revenge as to generosity. Next morning Lucetta remained in bed, meditating how to parry this incipient attack. The bold stroke of telling Donald the truth, dimly conceived, was yet too bold, for she dreaded lest in doing so he, like the rest of the world, should believe that the episode was rather her fault than her misfortune. She decided to employ persuasion, not with Donald, but with the enemy himself. It seemed the only practicable weapon left her as a woman. Having laid her plan, she rose and wrote to him who kept her on these tenterhooks. I overheard your interview with my husband last night, and saw the drift of your revenge. The very thought of it crushes me. Have pity on a distressed woman. If you could see me you would relent. You do not know how anxiety has told upon me lately. I will be at the Ring at the time you leave work, just before the sun goes down. Please come that way. I cannot rest till I have seen you face to face, and heard from your mouth that you will carry this horseplay no further." To herself she said, on closing up her appeal, "If ever tears and pleadings have served the weak to fight the strong, let them do so now." With this view she made a toilette which differed from all she had ever attempted before. To heighten her natural attraction had hitherto been the unvarying endeavour of her adult life, and one in which she was no novice. But now she neglected this, and even proceeded to impair the natural presentation. Beyond a natural reason for her slightly drawn look, she had not slept all the previous night, and this had produced upon her pretty though slightly worn features the aspect of a countenance aging prematurely from extreme sorrow. She selected, as much from want of spirit as design, her poorest, plainest, and longest discarded attire. To avoid the contingency of being recognized, she veiled herself, and slipped out of the house quickly. The sun was resting on the hill like a drop of blood on an eyelid by the time she had got up the road opposite the amphitheatre, which she speedily entered. The interior was shadowy, and emphatic of the absence of every living thing. She was not disappointed in the fearful hope with which she awaited him. Henchard came over the top, descended, and Lucetta waited breathlessly. But having reached the arena she saw a change in his bearing. He stood still at a little distance from her. She could not think why. Nor could anyone else have known. The truth was that in appointing this spot and this hour for the rendezvous, Lucetta had unwittingly backed up her entreaty by the strongest argument she could have used outside words, with this man of moods, glooms, and superstitions. Her figure in the midst of the huge enclosure, the unusual plainness of her dress, her attitude of hope and appeal, so strongly revived in his soul the memory of another ill-used woman who had stood there and thus in bygone days, and had now passed away into her rest, that he was unmanned, and his heart smote him for having attempted reprisals on one of a sex so weak. When he approached her, and before she had spoken a word, her point was half gained. His manner as he had come down had been one of cynical carelessness, but he now put away his grim half-smile, and said in a kindly subdued tone, "Good night, ye. Of course I am glad to come if you want me." "Oh, thank you," she said apprehensively. "I am sorry to see you looking so ill," he stammered with unconcealed compunction. She shook her head. "How can you be sorry," she asked, "when you deliberately cause it?" "What?" said Henchard uneasily. "Is it anything I have done that has pulled you down like that?" "It is all your doing," she said. "I have no other grief. My happiness would be secure enough but for your threats. Oh, Michael, don't wreck me like this. You might think that you have done enough. When I came here I was a young woman. Now I am rapidly becoming an old one. Neither my husband nor any other man will regard me with interest long." Henchard was disarmed. His old feeling of supercilious pity for womankind in general was intensified by this suppliant appearing here as the double of the first. Moreover, that thoughtless want of foresight which had led to all her trouble remained with poor Lucetta still. She had come to meet him here in this compromising way without perceiving the risk. Such a woman was very small deer to hunt. He felt ashamed, lost all zest and desire to humiliate Lucetta there and then, and no longer envied Farfrae his bargain. He had married money, but nothing more. Henchard was anxious to wash his hands of the game. "Well, what do you want me to do?" he said gently. "I am sure I shall be very willing. My reading of those letters was only a sort of practical joke, and I revealed nothing. To give me back the letters and any papers you may have that breathe of matrimony or worse, so be it. Every scrap shall be yours. But between you and me, Lucetta, he is sure to find out something of the matter sooner or later." "Ah," she said with eager tremulousness, "but not till I have proved myself a faithful and deserving wife to him, and then he may forgive me everything." Henchard silently looked at her. He almost envied Farfrae such love as that, even now. "I hope so," he said. "But you shall have the letters without fail. And your secret shall be kept, I swear it." "How good you are! How shall I get them?" He reflected, and said he would send them the next morning. "Now don't doubt me," he added. "I can keep my word." Chapter 35. Chapter 36. Returning from her appointment, Lucetta saw a man waiting by the lamp nearest to her own door. When she stopped to go in he came and spoke to her. It was Jopp. He begged her pardon for addressing her, but he had heard that Mr. Farfrae had been applied to by a neighbouring corn merchant to recommend a working partner. If so, he wished to offer himself. He could give good security, and had stated as much to Mr. Farfrae in a letter, but he would feel much obliged if Lucetta would say a word in his favour to her husband. "It is a thing I know nothing about," said Lucetta coldly. "But you can testify to my trustworthiness better than anybody, ma'am," said Jopp. "I was in Jersey several years, and knew you there by sight." "Indeed," she replied, "but I knew nothing of you." "I think, ma'am, that a word or two from you would secure for me what I covet very much," he persisted. She steadily refused to have anything to do with the affair, and cutting him short because of her anxiety to get indoors before her husband should miss her, left him on the pavement. He watched her till she had vanished, and then went home. When he got there he sat down in the fireless chimney corner, looking at the iron dogs and the wood laid across them for heating the morning kettle. A movement upstairs disturbed him, and Henchard came down from his bedroom, where he seemed to have been rummaging boxes. "I wish," said Henchard, "you would do me a service, Jopp. Now, to-night, I mean, if you can. Leave this at Mrs. Farfrae's for her. I should take it myself, of course, but I don't wish to be seen there." He handed a package in brown paper, sealed. Henchard had been as good as his word. Immediately on coming indoors he had searched over his few belongings, and every scrap of Lucetta's writing that he possessed was here. Jopp indifferently expressed his willingness. "Well, how have you got on to-day?" his lodger asked. "Any prospect of an opening?" "I am afraid not," said Jopp, who had not told the other of his application to Farfrae. "There never will be in Casterbridge," declared Henchard decisively. "You must roam further afield." He said good night to Jopp, and returned to his own part of the house. Jopp sat on till his eyes were attracted by the shadow of the candle snuff on the wall, and looking at the original he found that it had formed itself into a head like a red-hot cauliflower. Henchard's packet next met his gaze. He knew there had been something of the nature of wooing between Henchard and the now Mrs. Farfrae, and his vague ideas on the subject narrowed themselves down to these. Henchard had a parcel belonging to Mrs. Farfrae, and he had reasons for not returning that parcel to her in person. What could be inside it? So he went on and on till, animated by resentment at Lucetta's haughtiness, as he thought it, and curiosity to learn if there were any weak sides to this transaction with Henchard, he examined the package. The pen and all its relations being awkward tools in Henchard's hands, he had affixed the seals without an impression, it never occurring to him that the efficacy of such a fastening depended on this. Jopp was far less of a tyro. He lifted one of the seals with his penknife, peeped in at the end thus opened, saw that the bundle consisted of letters, and having satisfied himself thus far, sealed up the end again by simply softening the wax with the candle, and went off with the parcel as requested. His path was by the riverside at the foot of the town. Coming into the light at the bridge, which stood at the end of High Street, he beheld lounging thereon Mother Cuxsom and Nance Mockridge. "We be just going down Mixen Lane way to look into Peter's finger afore creeping to bed," said Mrs. Cuxsom. "There's a fiddle and tambourine going on there. Lord, what's all the world? Do ye come along too, Jopp. 'Twon't hinder ye 5 minutes." Jopp had mostly kept himself out of this company, but present circumstances made him somewhat more reckless than usual, and without many words he decided to go to his destination that way. Though the upper part of Durnover was mainly composed of a curious congeries of barns and farmsteads, there was a less picturesque side to the parish. This was Mixen Lane, now in great part pulled down. Mixen Lane was the Adullam of all the surrounding villages. It was the hiding place of those who were in distress and in debt, and trouble of every kind. Farm labourers and other peasants who combined a little poaching with their farming, and a little brawling and bibbing with their poaching, found themselves sooner or later in Mixen Lane. Rural mechanics too idle to mechanize, rural servants too rebellious to serve, drifted or were forced into Mixen Lane. The lane and its surrounding thicket of thatched cottages stretched out like a spit into the moist and misty lowland. Much that was sad, much that was low, some things that were baneful, could be seen in Mixen Lane. Vice ran freely in and out certain of the doors in the neighbourhood. Recklessness dwelt under the roof with the crooked chimney, shame in some bow windows, theft, in times of privation, in the thatched and mud-walled houses by the sallows. Even slaughter had not been altogether unknown here. In a block of cottages up an alley there might have been erected an altar to disease in years gone by. Such was Mixen Lane in the times when Henchard and Farfrae were mayors. Yet this mildewed leaf in the sturdy and flourishing Casterbridge plant lay close to the open country, not 100 yards from a row of noble elms, and commanding a view across the moor of airy uplands and cornfields and mansions of the great. A brook divided the moor from the tenements, and to outward view there was no way across it, no way to the houses but round about by the road. But under every householder's stairs there was kept a mysterious plank 9 inches wide, which plank was a secret bridge. If you, as one of those refugee householders, came in from business after dark, and this was the business time here, you stealthily crossed the moor, approached the border of the aforesaid brook, and whistled opposite the house to which you belonged. A shape thereupon made its appearance on the other side, bearing the bridge on end against the sky. It was lowered, you crossed, and a hand helped you to land yourself, together with the pheasants and hares gathered from neighbouring manors. You sold them slyly the next morning, and the day after you stood before the magistrates with the eyes of all your sympathizing neighbours concentrated on your back. You disappeared for a time, then you were again found quietly living in Mixen Lane. Walking along the lane at dusk, the stranger was struck by 2 or 3 peculiar features therein. One was an intermittent rumbling from the back premises of the inn halfway up. This meant a skittle alley. Another was the extensive prevalence of whistling in the various domiciles, a piped note of some kind coming from nearly every open door. Another was the frequency of white aprons over dingy gowns among the women around the doorways. A white apron is a suspicious vesture in situations where spotlessness is difficult. Moreover, the industry and cleanliness which the white apron expressed were belied by the postures and gaits of the women who wore it, their knuckles being mostly on their hips, an attitude which lent them the aspect of 2-handled mugs, and their shoulders against door-posts, while there was a curious alacrity in the turn of each honest woman's head upon her neck, and in the twirl of her honest eyes, at any noise resembling a masculine footfall along the lane. Yet amid so much that was bad, needy respectability also found a home. Under some of the roofs abode pure and virtuous souls whose presence there was due to the iron hand of necessity, and to that alone. Families from decayed villages, families of that once bulky but now nearly extinct section of village society called liveliers or life-holders, copyholders and others, whose roof-trees had fallen for some reason or other, compelling them to quit the rural spot that had been their home for generations, came here, unless they chose to lie under a hedge by the wayside. The inn called Peter's Finger was the church of Mixen Lane. It was centrally situate, as such places should be, and bore about the same social relation to the Three Mariners as the latter bore to the King's Arms. At first sight the inn was so respectable as to be puzzling. The front door was kept shut, and the step was so clean that evidently but few persons entered over its sanded surface. But at the corner of the public-house was an alley, a mere slit dividing it from the next building. Halfway up the alley was a narrow door, shiny and paintless from the rub of infinite hands and shoulders. This was the actual entrance to the inn. A pedestrian would be seen abstractedly passing along Mixen Lane, and then in a moment he would vanish, causing the gazer to blink like Ashton at the disappearance of Ravenswood. That abstracted pedestrian had edged into the slit by the adroit fillip of his person sideways. From the slit he edged into the tavern by a similar exercise of skill. The company at the Three Mariners were persons of quality in comparison with the company which gathered here, though it must be admitted that the lowest fringe of the Mariners' party touched the crest of Peter's at points. Waifs and strays of all sorts loitered about here. The landlady was a virtuous woman who years ago had been unjustly sent to jail as an accessory to something or other after the fact. She underwent her 12-month, and had worn a martyr's countenance ever since, except at times of meeting the constable who apprehended her when she winked her eye. To this house Jopp and his acquaintances had arrived. The settles on which they sat down were thin and tall, their tops being guyed by pieces of twine to hooks in the ceiling, for when the guests grew boisterous the settles would rock and overturn without some such security. The thunder of bowls echoed from the backyard, swingles hung behind the blower of the chimney, and ex-poachers and ex-gamekeepers whom squires had persecuted without a cause sat elbowing each other, men who in past times had met in fights under the moon, till lapse of sentences on the one part, and loss of favour and expulsion from service on the other, brought them here together to a common level, where they sat calmly discussing old times. "Dost mind how you could jerk a trout ashore with a bramble and not ruffle the stream, Charl?" a deposed keeper was saying. "'Twas at that I caught 'ee once, if you can mind." "That I can, but the worst larry for me was that pheasant business at Yalbury Wood. Your wife swore false that time, Joe. Oh, by gad, she did, there's no denying it." "How was that?" asked Jopp. "Why, Joe closed wi' me, and we rolled down together close to his garden hedge. Hearing the noise, out ran his wife with the oven pile, and it being dark under the trees she couldn't see which was uppermost. 'Where be'st thee, Joe, under or top?' she screeched. 'Oh, under, by gad,' says he. She then began to rap down upon my skull, back, and ribs with the pile till we'd roll over again. 'Where be'st now, dear Joe, under or top?' she'd scream again. By George, 'twas through her I was took, and then, when we got up in hall, she sware that the cock pheasant was one of her rearing, when 'twas not your bird at all, Joe. 'Twas Squire Brown's bird, that's whose 'twas, one that we'd picked off as we passed his wood an hour afore. It did hurt my feelings to be so wronged. Ah, well, 'tis over now." "I might have had 'ee days afore that," said the keeper. "I was within a few yards of 'ee dozens of times with a sight more of birds than that poor one." "Yes, 'tis not our greatest doings that the world gets wind of," said the furmity woman, who, lately settled in this purlieu, sat among the rest. Having travelled a great deal in her time, she spoke with cosmopolitan largeness of idea. It was she who presently asked Jopp what was the parcel he kept so snugly under his arm. "Ah, therein lies a grand secret," said Jopp. "It is the passion of love. To think that a woman should love one man so well and hate another so unmercifully." "Who's the object of your meditation, sir?" "One that stands high in this town. I'd like to shame her. Upon my life, 'twould be as good as a play to read her love letters, the proud piece of silk and waxwork, for 'tis her love letters that I've got here." "Love letters? Then let's hear 'em, good soul," said Mother Cuxsom. "Lord, do ye mind, Richard, what fools we used to be when we were younger, getting a schoolboy to write ours for us, and giving him a penny, do ye mind, not to tell other folks what he'd put inside, do ye mind?" By this time Jopp had pushed his finger under the seals and unfastened the letters, tumbling them over and picking up one here and there at random, which he read aloud. These passages soon began to uncover the secret which Lucetta had so earnestly hoped to keep buried, though the epistles, being allusive only, did not make it altogether plain. "Mrs. Farfrae wrote that," said Nance Mockridge. "'Tis a humbling thing for us, as respectable women, that one of the same sex could do it. And now she's avowed herself to another man?" "So much the better for her," said the aged furmity woman. "Ah, I saved her from a real bad marriage, and she's never been the one to thank me." "I say, what a good foundation for a skimmity ride," said Nance. "True," said Mrs. Cuxsom, reflecting. "'Tis as good a ground for a skimmity ride as ever I knowed, and it ought not to be wasted. The last one seen in Casterbridge must have been 10 years ago, if a day." At this moment there was a shrill whistle, and the landlady said to the man who had been called Charl, "'Tis Jim coming in. Would you go and let down the bridge for me?" Without replying, Charl and his comrade Joe rose, and receiving a lantern from her, went out at the back door and down the garden path, which ended abruptly at the edge of the stream already mentioned. Beyond the stream was the open moor, from which a clammy breeze smote upon their faces as they advanced. Taking up the board that had lain in readiness, one of them lowered it across the water, and the instant its further end touched the ground footsteps entered upon it, and there appeared from the shade a stalwart man with straps round his knees, a double-barreled gun under his arm, and some birds slung up behind him. They asked him if he had had much luck. "Not much," he said indifferently. "All safe inside?" Receiving a reply in the affirmative, he went on inwards, the others withdrawing the bridge and beginning to retreat in his rear. Before, however, they had entered the house, a cry of "Ahoy!" from the moor led them to pause. The cry was repeated. They pushed the lantern into an outhouse, and went back to the brink of the stream. "Ahoy! Is this the way to Casterbridge?" said some one from the other side. "Not in particular," said Charles. "There's a river afore 'ee." "I don't care. Here's for through it," said the man in the moor. "I've had travelling enough for to-day." "Stop a minute, then," said Charles, finding that the man was no enemy. "Joe, bring the plank and a lantern. Here's somebody that's lost his way. You should have kept along the turnpike road, friend, and not have struck across here." "I should, as I see now. But I saw a light here, and says I to myself, that's an outlying house, depend on't." The plank was now lowered, and the stranger's form shaped itself from the darkness. He was a middle-aged man, with hair and whiskers prematurely grey, and a broad and genial face. He had crossed on the plank without hesitation, and seemed to see nothing odd in the transit. He thanked them, and walked between them up the garden. "What place is this?" he asked, when they reached the door. "A public-house." "Ah, perhaps it will suit me to put up at. Now then, come in and wet your whistle at my expense for the lift-over you have given me." They followed him into the inn, where the increased light exhibited him as one who would stand higher in an estimate by the eye than in one by the ear. He was dressed with a certain clumsy richness, his coat being furred, and his head covered by a cap of sealskin, which, though the nights were chilly, must have been warm for the daytime, spring being somewhat advanced. In his hand he carried a small mahogany case, strapped and clamped with brass. Apparently surprised at the kind of company which confronted him through the kitchen door, he at once abandoned his idea of putting up at the house. But taking the situation lightly, he called for glasses of the best, paid for them as he stood in the passage, and turned to proceed on his way by the front door. This was barred, and while the landlady was unfastening it, the conversation about the skimmington was continued in the sitting-room and reached his ears. "What do they mean by a skimmity ride?" he asked. "Oh, sir," said the landlady, swinging her long earrings with deprecating modesty, "'tis a old foolish thing they do in these parts when a man's wife is, well, not too particularly his own. But as a respectable householder I don't encourage it." "Still, are they going to do it shortly? It is a good sight to see, I suppose." "Well, sir," she simpered, and then bursting into naturalness and glancing from the corner of her eye, "'tis the funniest thing under the sun, and it costs money." "Ah, I remember hearing of some such thing. Now I shall be in Casterbridge for 2 or 3 weeks to come, and should not mind seeing the performance. Wait a moment." He turned back, entered the sitting-room, and said, "Here, good folks, I should like to see the old custom you are talking of, and I don't mind being something towards it. Take that." He threw a sovereign on the table, and returned to the landlady at the door, of whom, having inquired the way into the town, he took his leave. "There were more where that one came from," said Charles, when the sovereign had been taken up and handed to the landlady for safe-keeping. "By George, we ought to have got a few more while we had him here." "No, no," answered the landlady. "This is a respectable house, thank God, and I'll have nothing done but what's honourable." "Well," said Jopp, "now we'll consider the business begun, and we'll soon get it in train." "We will," said Nance. "A good laugh warms my heart more than a cordial, and that's the truth on't." Jopp gathered up the letters, and it being now somewhat late he did not attempt to call at Farfrae's with them that night. He reached home, sealed them up as before, and delivered the parcel at its address next morning. Within an hour its contents were reduced to ashes by Lucetta, who, poor soul, was inclined to fall down on her knees in thankfulness that at last no evidence remained of the unlucky episode with Henchard in her past. For though hers had been rather the laxity of inadvertence than of intention, that episode, if known, was not the less likely to operate fatally between herself and her husband. End of Chapter 36. Chapter 37. Such was the state of things when the current affairs of Casterbridge were interrupted by an event of such magnitude that its influence reached to the lowest social stratum there, stirring the depths of its society simultaneously with the preparations for the skimmington. It was one of those excitements which, when they move a country town, leave permanent mark upon its chronicles, as a warm summer permanently marks the ring in the tree-trunk corresponding to its date. A royal personage was about to pass through the borough on his course further west, to inaugurate an immense engineering work out that way. He had consented to halt half an hour or so in the town, and to receive an address from the Corporation of Casterbridge, which, as a representative centre of husbandry, wished thus to express its sense of the great services he had rendered to agricultural science and economics by his zealous promotion of designs for placing the art of farming on a more scientific footing. Royalty had not been seen in Casterbridge since the days of the third King George, and then only by candle-light for a few minutes, when that monarch on a night journey had stopped to change horses at the King's Arms. The inhabitants therefore decided to make a thorough fête carillonnée of the unwonted occasion. Half an hour's pause was not long, it is true, but much might be done in it by a judicious grouping of incidents, above all if the weather were fine. The address was prepared on parchment by an artist who was handy at ornamental lettering, and was laid on with the best gold leaf and colours that the sign-painter had in his shop. The council had met on the Tuesday before the appointed day to arrange the details of the procedure. While they were sitting, the door of the council chamber standing open, they heard a heavy footstep coming up the stairs. It advanced along the passage, and Henchard entered the room, in clothes of frayed and threadbare shabbiness, the very clothes which he had used to wear in the primal days when he had sat among them. "I have a feeling," he said, advancing to the table and laying his hand upon the green cloth, "that I should like to join ye in this reception of our illustrious visitor. I suppose I could walk with the rest?" Embarrassed glances were exchanged by the council, and Grower nearly ate the end of his quill pen off, so gnawed he it during the silence. Farfrae, the young mayor, who by virtue of his office sat in the large chair, intuitively caught the sense of the meeting, and as spokesman was obliged to utter it, glad as he would have been that the duty should have fallen to another tongue. "I hardly see that it would be proper, Mr. Henchard," said he. "The council are the council, and as ye are no longer one of the body, there would be an irregularity in the proceeding. If ye were included, why not others?" "I have a particular reason for wishing to assist at the ceremony." Farfrae looked round. "I think I have expressed the feeling of the council," he said. "Yes, yes," from Dr. Bath, Lawyer Long, Alderman Tubber, and several more. "Then I am not to be allowed to have anything to do with it officially?" "I am afraid so. It is out of the question indeed. But of course you can see the doings full well, such as they are to be, like the rest of the spectators." Henchard did not reply to that very obvious suggestion, and turning on his heel went away. It had been only a passing fancy of his, but opposition crystallized it into a determination. "I'll welcome his Royal Highness, or nobody shall," he went about saying. "I am not going to be sat upon by Farfrae, or any of the rest of the paltry crew. You shall see." The eventful morning was bright, a full-faced sun confronting early window-gazers eastward, and all perceived, for they were practised in weather lore, that there was permanence in the glow. Visitors soon began to flock in from county houses, villages, remote copses, and lonely uplands, the latter in oiled boots and tilt bonnets, to see the reception, or if not to see it, at any rate to be near it. There was hardly a workman in the town who did not put a clean shirt on. Solomon Longways, Christopher Coney, Buzzford, and the rest of that fraternity showed their sense of the occasion by advancing their customary 11 o'clock pint to 10:30, from which they found a difficulty in getting back to the proper hour for several days. Henchard had determined to do no work that day. He primed himself in the morning with a glass of rum, and walking down the street met Elizabeth Jane, whom he had not seen for a week. "It was lucky," he said to her. "My 21 years had expired before this came on, or I should never have had the nerve to carry it out." "Carry out what?" said she, alarmed. "This welcome I am going to give our royal visitor." She was perplexed. "Shall we go and see it together?" she said. "See it? I have other fish to fry. You see it. It will be worth seeing." She could do nothing to elucidate this, and decked herself out with a heavy heart. As the appointed time drew near, she got sight again of her stepfather. She thought he was going to the Three Mariners, but no, he elbowed his way through the gay throng to the shop of Wolfrey, the draper. She waited in the crowd without. In a few minutes he emerged, wearing, to her surprise, a brilliant rosette, while more surprising still, in his hand he carried a flag of somewhat homely construction, formed by tacking one of the small Union Jacks, which abounded in the town to-day, to the end of a deal wand, probably the roller from a piece of calico. Henchard rolled up his flag on the doorstep, put it under his arm, and went down the street. Suddenly the taller members of the crowd turned their heads, and the shorter stood on tiptoe. It was said that the royal cortège approached. The railway had stretched out an arm towards Casterbridge at this time, but had not reached it by several miles as yet, so that the intervening distance, as well as the remainder of the journey, was to be traversed by road in the old fashion. People thus waited, the county families in their carriages, the masses on foot, and watched the far-stretching London highway to the ringing of bells and chatter of tongues. From the background Elizabeth Jane watched the scene. Some seats had been arranged from which ladies could witness the spectacle, and the front seat was occupied by Lucetta, the mayor's wife, just at present. In the road under her eyes stood Henchard. She appeared so bright and pretty that, as it seemed, he was experiencing the momentary weakness of wishing for her notice. But he was far from attractive to a woman's eye, ruled as that is so largely by the superficies of things. He was not only a journeyman, unable to appear as he formerly had appeared, but he disdained to appear as well as he might. Everybody else, from the mayor to the washerwoman, shone in new vesture according to means, but Henchard had doggedly retained the fretted and weather-beaten garments of bygone years. Hence, alas, this occurred. Lucetta's eyes slid over him to this side and to that without anchoring on his features, as gaily dressed women's eyes will too often do on such occasions. Her manner signified quite plainly that she meant to know him in public no more. But she was never tired of watching Donald, as he stood in animated converse with his friends a few yards off, wearing round his young neck the official gold chain with great square links, like that round the royal unicorn. Every trifling emotion that her husband showed as he talked had its reflex on her face and lips, which moved in little duplicates to his. She was living his part rather than her own, and cared for no one's situation but Farfrae's that day. At length the man stationed at the furthest turn of the high road, namely on the second bridge of which mention has been made, gave a signal, and the corporation in their robes proceeded from the front of the town hall to the archway erected at the entrance to the town. The carriages containing the royal visitor and his suite arrived at the spot in a cloud of dust. A procession was formed, and the whole came on to the town hall at a walking pace. This spot was the centre of interest. There were a few clear yards in front of the royal carriage, sanded, and into this space a man stepped before anyone could prevent him. It was Henchard. He had unrolled his private flag, and removing his hat he staggered to the side of the slowing vehicle, waving the Union Jack to and fro with his left hand, while he blandly held out his right to the illustrious personage. All the ladies said, with bated breath, "Oh, look there!" and Lucetta was ready to faint. Elizabeth Jane peeped through the shoulders of those in front, saw what it was, and was terrified, and then her interest in the spectacle as a strange phenomenon got the better of her fear. Farfrae, with mayoral authority, immediately rose to the occasion. He seized Henchard by the shoulder, dragged him back, and told him roughly to be off. Henchard's eyes met his, and Farfrae observed the fierce light in them, despite his excitement and irritation. For a moment Henchard stood his ground rigidly, then by an unaccountable impulse gave way and retired. Farfrae glanced to the ladies' gallery, and saw that his Calphurnia's cheek was pale. "Why, it is your husband's old patron," said Mrs. Blowbody, a lady of the neighbourhood who sat beside Lucetta. "Patron!" said Donald's wife, with quick indignation. "Do you say the man is an acquaintance of Mr. Farfrae's?" observed Mrs. Bath, the physician's wife, a newcomer to the town through her recent marriage with the doctor. "He works for my husband," said Lucetta. "Oh, is that all? They have been saying to me that it was through him your husband first got a footing in Casterbridge. What stories people will tell!" "They will indeed. It was not so at all. Donald's genius would have enabled him to get a footing anywhere without anybody's help. He would have been just the same if there had been no Henchard in the world." It was partly Lucetta's ignorance of the circumstances of Donald's arrival which led her to speak thus, partly the sensation that everybody seemed bent on snubbing her at this triumphant time. The incident had occupied but a few moments, but it was necessarily witnessed by the royal personage, who, however, with practised tact, affected not to have noticed anything unusual. He alighted, the mayor advanced, the address was read, the illustrious personage replied, then said a few words to Farfrae, and shook hands with Lucetta as the mayor's wife. The ceremony occupied but a few minutes, and the carriages rattled heavily as Pharaoh's chariots down Corn Street and out upon the Budmouth Road, in continuation of the journey coastward. In the crowd stood Coney, Buzzford, and Longways. "Some difference between him now and when he hung at the Dree Mariners," said the first. "'Tis wonderful how he could get a lady of her quality to go snacks wi' in such quick time." "True. Yet how folk do worship fine clothes. Now there's a better-looking woman than she that nobody notices at all, because she's akin to that hauntish fellow Henchard." "I could worship ye, Buzz, for saying that," remarked Nance Mockridge. "I do like to see the trimming pulled off such Christmas candles. I am quite unequal to the part of villain myself, or I'd gi' all my small silver to see that lady toppered, and perhaps I shall soon," she added significantly. "That's not a noble passion for a 'oman to keep up," said Longways. Nance did not reply, but every one knew what she meant. The ideas diffused by the reading of Lucetta's letters that Peter's finger had condensed into a scandal, which was spreading like a miasmatic fog through Mixton Lane, and thence up the back streets of Casterbridge. The mixed assemblage of idlers known to each other presently fell apart into two bands by a process of natural selection, the frequenters of Peter's finger going off Mixton Lanewards, where most of them lived, while Coney, Buzzford, Longways, and that connection remained in the street. "You know what's brewing down there, I suppose," said Buzzford mysteriously to the others. Coney looked at him. "Not the skimmity ride?" Buzzford nodded. "I have my doubts if it will be carried out," said Longways. "If they are getting it up, they are keeping it mighty close." "I heard they were thinking of it a fortnight ago, at all events." "If I were sure o't, I'd lay information," said Longways emphatically. "'Tis too rough a joke, and apt to wake riots in towns. We know that the Scotchman is a right enough man, and that his lady has been a right enough woman since she came here, and if there was anything wrong about her afore, that's their business, not ours." Coney reflected. Farfrae was still liked in the community, but it must be owned that as the mayor and man of money, engrossed with affairs and ambitions, he had lost in the eyes of the poorer inhabitants something of that wondrous charm which he had had for them as a light-hearted, penniless young man who sang ditties as readily as the birds in the trees. Hence the anxiety to keep him from annoyance showed not quite the ardour that would have animated it in former days. "Suppose we make inquiration into it, Christopher," continued Longways, "and if we find there's really anything in it, drop a letter to them most concerned and advise 'em to keep out of the way." This course was decided on, and the group separated, Buzzford saying to Coney, "Come, my ancient friend, let's move on. There's nothing more to see here." These well-intentioned ones would have been surprised had they known how ripe the great jocular plot really was. "Yes, to-night," Jopp had said to the Peters party at the corner of Mixton Lane. "As a wind-up to the royal visit, the hit will be all the more pat by reason of their great elevation to-day." To him, at least, it was not a joke, but a retaliation. Chapter 37. Chapter 38. The proceedings had been brief, too brief, to Lucetta, whom an intoxicating welt-lust had fairly mastered. But they had brought her a great triumph, nevertheless. The shake of the royal hand still lingered in her fingers, and the chit-chat she had overheard, that her husband might possibly receive the honour of knighthood, though idle to a degree, seemed not the wildest vision. Stranger things had occurred to men so good and captivating as her Scotchman was. After the collision with the Mayor, Henchard had withdrawn behind the ladies' stand, and there he stood, regarding with a stare of abstraction the spot on the lapel of his coat where Farfrae's hand had seized it. He put his own hand there, as if he could hardly realize such an outrage from one whom it had once been his wont to treat with ardent generosity. While pausing in this half-stupefied state, the conversation of Lucetta with the other ladies reached his ears, and he distinctly heard her deny that he had assisted Donald, that he was anything more than a common journeyman. He moved on homeward, and met Jop in the archway to the Bull Stake. "So you've had a snub," said Jop. "What if I have?" answered Henchard sternly. "Why, I've had one too, so we are both under the same cold shade." He briefly related his attempt to win Lucetta's intercession. Henchard merely heard his story without taking it deeply in. His own relation to Farfrae and Lucetta overshadowed all kindred ones. He went on, saying brokenly to himself, "She has supplicated to me in her time, and now her tongue won't own me nor her eyes see me. And he! How angry he looked! He drove me back as if I were a bull-breaking fence. I took it like a lamb, for I saw it could not be settled there. He can rub brine on a green wound, but he shall pay for it, and she shall be sorry. It must come to a tussle, face to face, and then we'll see how a coxcomb can confront a man." Without further reflection, the fallen merchant, bent on some wild purpose, ate a hasty dinner and went forth to find Farfrae. After being injured by him as a rival and snubbed by him as a journeyman, the crowning degradation had been reserved for this day, that he should be shaken at the collar by him as a vagabond in the face of the whole town. The crowds had dispersed. But for the green arches which still stood as they were erected, Casterbridge life had resumed its ordinary shape. Henchard went down Corn Street till he came to Farfrae's house, where he knocked, and left a message that he would be glad to see his employer at the granaries as soon as he conveniently could come there. Having done this, he proceeded round to the back and entered the yard. Nobody was present, for, as he had been aware, the labourers and carters were enjoying a half-holiday on account of the events of the morning, though the carters would have to return for a short time later on to feed and litter down the horses. He had reached the granary steps and was about to ascend, when he said to himself aloud, "I'm stronger than he." Henchard returned to his shed, where he selected a short piece of rope from several pieces that were lying about. Hitching one end of this to a nail, he took the other in his right hand, and turned himself bodily round, while keeping his arm against his side. By this contrivance he pinioned the arm effectively. He now went up the ladders to the top floor of the corn stores. It was empty except of a few sacks, and at the further end was the door often mentioned, opening under the cat head and chain that hoisted the sacks. He fixed the door open and looked over the sill. There was a depth of 30 or 40 feet to the ground. Here was the spot on which he had been standing with Farfrae when Elizabeth Jane had seen him lift his arm with many misgivings as to what the movement portended. He retired a few steps into the loft and waited. From this elevated perch his eyes could sweep the roofs round about, the upper parts of the luxurious chestnut trees, now delicate and leaves of a week's age, and the drooping boughs of the lines, Farfrae's garden and the green door leading therefrom. In course of time, he could not say how long, that green door opened and Farfrae came through. He was dressed as if for a journey. The low light of the nearing evening caught his head and face when he emerged from the shadow of the wall, warming them to a complexion of flame colour. Henchard watched him with his mouth firmly set, the squareness of his jaw and the verticality of his profile being unduly marked. Farfrae came on with one hand in his pocket, and humming a tune in a way which told that the words were most in his mind. They were those of the song he had sung when he arrived years before at the Three Mariners, a poor young man, adventuring for life and fortune, and scarcely knowing whitherward. "And here's a hand, my trusty fear, and gi'es a hand o' thine." Nothing moved Henchard like an old melody. He sank back. "No, I can't do it," he gasped. "Why does the infernal fool begin that now?" At length Farfrae was silent, and Henchard looked out of the loft door. "Will ye come up here?" he said. "Eh, man," said Farfrae, "I couldn't see ye. What's wrang?" A minute later Henchard heard his feet on the lowest ladder. He heard him land on the first floor, ascend and land on the second, begin the ascent to the third, and then his head rose through the trap behind. "What are you doing up here at this time?" he asked, coming forward. "Why didn't ye take your holiday like the rest of the men?" He spoke in a tone which had just severity enough in it to show that he remembered the untoward event of the forenoon, and his conviction that Henchard had been drinking. Henchard said nothing, but going back he closed the stair hatchway and stamped upon it, so that it went tight into its frame. He next turned to the wondering young man, who by this time observed that one of Henchard's arms was bound to his side. "Now," said Henchard quietly, "we stand face to face, man and man. Your money and your fine wife no longer lift ye above me as they did but now, and my poverty does not press me down." "What does it all mean?" asked Farfrae simply. "Wait a bit, my lad. You should ha' thought twice before you affronted to extremes a man who had nothing to lose. I've stood your rivalry, which ruined me, and your snubbing, which humbled me, but your hustling that disgraced me I won't stand." Farfrae warmed a little at this. "Ye'd no business there," he said. "As much as any one among ye. What, you forward stripling, tell a man of my age he'd no business there?" The anger veins swelled in his forehead as he spoke. "You insulted royalty, Henchard, and 'twas my duty as the chief magistrate to stop you." "Royalty be damned," said Henchard. "I am as loyal as you, come to that." "I am not here to argue. Wait till you cool doon. Wait till you cool, and you will see things the same way as I do." "You may be the one to cool first," said Henchard grimly. "Now this is the case. Here be we in this 4-square loft to finish out that little wrestle you began this morning. There's the door, 40 foot above ground. One of us two puts the other out by that door. The master stays inside. If he likes he may go down afterwards and give the alarm that the other has fallen out by accident, or he may tell the truth. That's his business. As the strongest man I've tied one arm to take no advantage of 'ee. D'ye understand? Then here's at 'ee." There was no time for Farfrae to do aught but one thing, to close with Henchard, for the latter had come on at once. It was a wrestling match, the object of each being to give his antagonist a backfall, and on Henchard's part unquestionably that it should be through the door. At the outset Henchard's hold by his only free hand, the right, was on the left side of Farfrae's collar, which he firmly grappled, the latter holding Henchard by his collar with the contrary hand. With his right he endeavoured to get hold of his antagonist's left arm, which, however, he could not do, so adroitly did Henchard keep it in the rear as he gazed upon the lowered eyes of his fair and slim antagonist. Henchard planted the first toe forward, Farfrae crossing him with his, and thus far the struggle had very much the appearance of the ordinary wrestling of those parts. Several minutes were passed by them in this attitude, the pair rocking and writhing like trees in a gale, both preserving an absolute silence. By this time their breathing could be heard. Then Farfrae tried to get hold of the other side of Henchard's collar, which was resisted by the larger man exerting all his force in a wrenching movement, and this part of the struggle ended by his forcing Farfrae down on his knees by sheer pressure of one of his muscular arms. Hampered as he was, however, he could not keep him there, and Farfrae finding his feet again, the struggle proceeded as before. By a whirl Henchard brought Donald dangerously near the precipice. Seeing his position, the Scotchman for the first time locked himself to his adversary, and all the efforts of that infuriated Prince of Darkness, as he might have been called from his appearance just now, were inadequate to lift or loosen Farfrae for a time. By an extraordinary effort he succeeded at last, though not until they had got far back again from the fatal door. In doing so Henchard contrived to turn Farfrae a complete somersault. Had Henchard's other arm been free, it would have been all over with Farfrae then. But again he regained his feet, wrenching Henchard's arm considerably, and causing him sharp pain, as could be seen from the twitching of his face. He instantly delivered the younger man an annihilating turn by the left fore-hip, as it used to be expressed, and following up his advantage, thrust him towards the door, never loosening his hold till Farfrae's fair head was hanging over the window-sill and his arm dangling down outside the wall. "Now," said Henchard between his gasps, "this is the end of what you began this morning. Your life is in my hands." "Then take it, said Farfrae. "You've wished too long enough." Henchard looked down upon him in silence, and their eyes met. "Oh, Farfrae, that's not true," he said bitterly. "God is my witness that no man ever loved another as I did thee at one time. And now, though I came here to kill 'ee, I cannot hurt thee. Go and give me in charge. Do what you will. I care nothing for what comes of me." He withdrew to the back part of the loft, loosened his arm, and flung himself in a corner upon some sacks in the abandonment of remorse. Farfrae regarded him in silence, then went to the hatch and descended through it. Henchard would fain have recalled him, but his tongue failed in its task, and the young man's steps died on his ear. Henchard took his full measure of shame and self-reproach. The scenes of his first acquaintance with Farfrae rushed back upon him, that time when the curious mixture of romance and thrift in the young man's composition so commanded his heart that Farfrae could play upon him as on an instrument. So thoroughly subdued was he that he remained on the sacks in a crouching attitude, unusual for a man, and for such a man. Its womanliness sat tragically on the figure of so stern a piece of virility. He heard a conversation below, the opening of the coach-house door, and the putting in of a horse, but took no notice. Here he stayed till the thin shades thickened to opaque obscurity, and the loft door became an oblong of grey light, the only visible shape around. At length he arose, shook the dust from his clothes wearily, felt his way to the hatch, and gropingly descended the steps till he stood in the yard. "He thought highly of me once," he murmured. "Now he'll hate me and despise me forever." He became possessed by an overpowering wish to see Farfrae again that night, and by some desperate pleading to attempt the well-nigh impossible task of winning pardon for his late mad attack. But as he walked towards Farfrae's door he recalled the unheeded doings in the yard while he had lain above in a sort of stupor. Farfrae, he remembered, had gone to the stable and put the horse into the gig. While doing so, Whittle had brought him a letter. Farfrae had then said that he would not go towards Budmouth as he had intended, that he was unexpectedly summoned to Weatherbury, and meant to call at Mellstock on his way thither, that place lying but 1 or 2 miles out of his course. He must have come prepared for a journey when he first arrived in the yard, unsuspecting enmity, and he must have driven off, though in a changed direction, without saying a word to any one on what had occurred between themselves. It would therefore be useless to call at Farfrae's house till very late. There was no help for it but to wait till his return, though waiting was almost torture to his restless and self-accusing soul. He walked about the streets and outskirts of the town, lingering here and there till he reached the stone bridge of which mention has been made, an accustomed halting-place with him now. Here he spent a long time, the purl of waters through the weirs meeting his ear, and the Casterbridge lights glimmering at no great distance off. While leaning thus upon the parapet, his listless attention was awakened by sounds of an unaccustomed kind from the town quarter. They were a confusion of rhythmical noises, to which the streets added yet more confusion by encumbering them with echoes. His first incurious thought that the clangor arose from the town band, engaged in an attempt to round off a memorable day in a burst of evening harmony, was contradicted by certain peculiarities of reverberation. But inexplicability did not rouse him to more than a cursory heed. His sense of degradation was too strong for the admission of foreign ideas, and he leant against the parapet as before. End of chapter 38.